Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Reasonably Happy. My name is Paul Allinger. Thank you for being here today. My guest this week is Steve Chamberlain, a former media executive whose career has intersected with some of the biggest brands and celebrities in entertainment history. Steve started out as a local television news reporter in the bustling metropolis of Biloxi, Mississippi, but redirected his talents toward the business side of media, eventually landing at a Young Turner Broadcasting in Atlanta, Georgia, where he ran Turner Home Entertainment and oversaw divisions including Worldwide Home Video, merchandising, licensing, and pay-per-view. During his time there, Turner acquired the MGM movie library, for which Steve managed the 50th anniversary celebrations of classic films like The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, Citizen Kane, as well as animation studio Hanna-Barbera, which brought iconic characters like the Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, and the Jetsons into the company. After Turner, Steve led the marketing of Frank Sinatra's final albums, Duets, and was brought in by EMI to help lead the launch of the Beatles Anthology, which became the highest-grossing music compilation series in history. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Speaking of today Steve is an early-stage tech investor and advisor who has backed dozens of startups, including an early investment in WebMD. This, my friends, is Steve Chamberlain. You're never going to be perfectly happy all the time. The best you can hope for is to be reasonably happy. Most of the time. So what I did love in what you sent me over is that picture of you and Ric Flair. Where was that taken?
Well, that was taken in Las Vegas at one of our conventions, and we would have our own booth out there, Turner Home Entertainment, along with the other major studios like Sony and Universal. And we'd bring out stars that had been in some of our motion pictures. But wrestling was something that fell underneath me in terms of distribution.
Really?
And so, yeah.
Starting when, in like 83? Is that when you were?
Oh, no, it was really in about 1987, 88. And we Turner Broadcasting ended up buying a wrestling company.
So just before you go into it, I want to say I grew up in Atlanta, so I remember watching Saturday morning wrestling with Gordon Solie.
That's it.
Or Gordon Solo, or whatever his name was. That was filmed downtown. You know, when it was channel. Yeah, it was a UHF station, Channel 17.
Right, and it was filmed in the basement of where Ted Turner's office was physically. And these people would come in on Saturday morning, park their cars there, and we'd let them into the studio. You would think that there was like 500 people in there. There's probably 60 or 70, but it's black curtains and all these sound effects and stuff. And I used to take friends of mine down there, because the wrestlers all knew me in the back and all that stuff, and we were having a good time. They were just, my job was to suspend somebody's disbelief, and we did it pretty good. What we ended up doing is getting into the pay-per-view business, and that was another division that came underneath me. So we would do 6 of those a year. And it was the early days. We could only clear about 12 to 14 million households. Today you can do 100 million. But
that was what, WCW was the name of the league?
World Championship Wrestling, and our host was Gordon Solie.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of funny stories about it. And
what was the pay-per-view cost, and what was a big event that somebody would pay for back then?
Yeah, we would. It started like $14.95, so we would go direct to the household, and then there were other bars and restaurants and stuff that we would license it to. So it grew dramatically over the years. But back in the very beginning, there were only 2 pay-per-view providers, and it was only about 10 million households we had access to it. But it grew quickly, and it became a very big business. Very important to the health of the company, the wrestling company.
So it's interesting, like looking at your resume and thinking about, every time there's a new technological innovation, there's a new opportunity to sell content through that channel.
Right.
And you had a home entertainment at Turner in the 80s. Does that mean Blockbuster was your biggest client? You were selling VHS
at the beginning.
VHS tapes?
I mean, let me give you a really good example from the wrestling point of view.
Yeah.
They had never been in the pay-per-view business. They didn't know what it was. It also occurred to me that people, they may not have access to pay-per-view, but they've got access to a telephone. And so I ended up going out to Las Vegas, and I literally met with 3 gangsters And at that time, there were only like 200 of these unlimited 1-900, phone numbers.
I got in trouble. I got in trouble with my parents for using one of those a few
Right.
times.
So I ended up buying one. Ted Turner let me pay him, like, they wanted to become partners with us. And I was telling these guys, I said, look, we're a public company. I can't do that. I mean, when we release our stock report, we would have to mention you as individuals and your contribution. No, oh, no, we can't do that. So I ended up writing a check for like $250,000. And Ted Turner said, well, this better work, Steve. Well, what I was doing is during the show, that night, we would tell them on Superstation TBS, and we'd have 5 million people on there watching the beginning of it. Go to your phone and listen. And it's only $2 a minute. And I swear to God, I mean, it was 100,000 people every time I would go on there on the phone and listen.
Wow.
They're not even watching video.
And it would be the wrestlers talking smack to each other. Is that the idea?
They're crazy, but that is a good example of finding another method of distribution.
Right.
Another way, as Ted Turner used to say, look, we've got this chicken here, right? We're going to cut this thing into 20 different pieces. And that's what we did.
Right.
That was a good example of what you're talking about. The beginning of our business, when we bought MGM in 1986, was largely centered on rental. And we would sell our, like, Gone with the Wind and that kind of thing to Blockbuster for like $100 a pop. And that they in turn would
per cassette.
Right. By renting it out 30 times, and then they were in the black, and then they would own it. And that went on for until about, I'd say 1987, when the beginning of DVD was introduced.
Right.
And it became a sell-through business and no longer really a rental business. And people would begin to buy and collect movies like they bought and collect music and books for many years. So what it was for us is another chance for us to rotate our content through a different distribution mechanism.
Yeah.
And that's why these studios are so valuable. They depend wholly on those libraries to generate the cash in between making new motion pictures. That's what it's all about.
That's the bread and butter, and they hope to make big money on top of that with the lottery, the roulette wheel that is production of new motion pictures.
Yeah. I've had a lot of people ask me recently, over the years, say, Steve, do you think that you could oversee the distribution of a major theatrical motion picture today? And I say, no, I don't think I could. And then I stop and I say, by the way, I don't think the people that are doing it today know what they're doing either. So this is the conflict that you're seeing recently with Netflix and Paramount and all that. You're disrupting the cycle.
Yeah.
What they're saying is that we're going to make this motion picture and we're going to go direct to Netflix. And this is causing all kinds of havoc within the entertainment industry.
When you were at Turner, it seems to me, thinking about it, we think about startups as being exclusively online kinds of things, but a startup is really anything that disrupts an industry or creates new categories for which there isn't a roadmap on which to write a new business plan. I mean, Turner was a disruptor. Cable television didn't exist when he bought WTCG.
Well, that's right. And what he did is he figured out a way to put that up on the satellite. TBS was one of the very few cable networks that were at the beginning. And then he had, all these like Leave It to Beaver and the Braves baseball, and that became America's Superstation. That's what it was called. Mm-hmm. And that gave us the monetary wherewithal to launch other networks, especially CNN. And you could not
talk about inventing a category.
Yeah, you couldn't imagine doing something like that. I mean, all news was coming out of New York. That's where the news center was. But because of satellites, we were able to, they used to call us the Chicken Noodle Network because they laughed at us. And in the beginning, that's how I started my career there. In 1983, I was involved in cable sales. And we had to sell it like our networks, like you're going to a library and you have several books that you can sell. We would package them to the cable operators and give them discounts.
So you're sorry, just to back up 1 second. You're going to the MSOs.
That's right.
What is it? Multi-service operators? Is that what that stood for? And so this was the regional cable distributor that had a monopoly on all the homes in that area, right?
Correct. Yeah, but back then when we were starting out, in the early 80s, 83 when I joined, you were dealing with thousands of cable operators. Today you're dealing with 5.
Right.
So you have mass consolidation. But
it was a local utility, guys, with short sleeves and ties.
Old timers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a utility. It's exactly what it was. And what they did is rally around Ted Turner, because he became the face of a utility.
Right.
That became something that consumers admired, and they got behind us, and we launched all these networks, and the rest is history. But those, I single-handedly give him credit, because he is the one that rallied those people. Even in the darkest times, when we bought MGM in 1986, the truth is it almost bankrupted our company. I think you know.
Yeah.
And we had to immediately sell the studio back, the real estate, Technicolor, which was a film processing company. All we were left with was the MGM film library. And that was 5,000 motion pictures on MGM side from 1980 back, the pre-1950 Warner Brothers library, and RKO. And altogether it was 5,000. So what Ted Turner was doing is stabilizing the cost of what he'd have to pay syndicators for content for our entertainment networks. That was what it was all about. But what almost made us bankrupt is because we had 19 brand new motion pictures in production, and only 2 of them worked.
Which were those 2?
Running Scared was one of the few that worked. I remember that one, and one other one. But
was that Gregory Hines? Was that?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And the rest all went, lost hundreds of millions of dollars. So you're talking about a company that's, making hundreds of millions of dollars, and then you're acquiring something that you really don't understand from a cost standpoint. And so we went into an emergency mode and and Kirk Kerkorian, who was the person that we bought MGM from, bought 90% of the stuff back. That's what it was. And, but it was ahead of its time. Ted Turner understood the value of content. And he says it himself. I'm not saying it. He said, I went to Los Angeles fully dressed, and I came back to Atlanta in a barrel.
That's such a Ted Turner expression. What was he like to work with? He was called Captain Outrageous. He was he was kind of a wild man, right?
Yeah, he was. At the beginning, we only had a couple of hundred people, so it was all hands on deck. Today, I guess 20,000 people. But, I ended up spending quite a bit of time with him, and he is a mercurial person, and you must understand that. You must understand also he's a genius. And it comes
those two often go together.
Oh, I do things like, okay, Ted, I'm doing this. It's the 50th anniversary of The Wizard of Oz, and we're going to do it at the Plaza Hotel in New York. And I want you to be there because we're going to do a press conference. And normally that, it's a nice thing, but it wouldn't draw that big of it. You'd have 100 reporters show up, not because they're interested in The Wizard of Oz.
Right.
They're interested in him saying something so outrageous that it's going to be front page news. And he doesn't care. He's one of these people, he doesn't have a filter. Yeah. So whatever he's thinking comes out. And I'll tell you this,
I know I read about every day about a person in our country who doesn't have a filter.
No, I understand it perfectly. I saw him, it's been about 10 years ago, but I wanted to get him in a deal with me, and he didn't want to do it, but he had his secretary call me and asked me to come downtown, and he just wanted to talk to me. So I sat in his private office with him and talked about old times. And I said, something, Ted, no matter where I go, people know that I worked for Turner Broadcasting. But they want to know every single time, did I ever meet you personally? And he goes, come on, Steve, you're kidding, right? I said, no, seriously. And what do you tell him? I said, well, some days I might meet you 20, 25 times because unfortunately I had an office right across from yours. So when you'd go off on a tangent, you come in my office and start screaming, I don't even know what you're talking about. So that's kind of what it was. But you'll find this really interesting. He put me in a very big job at a pretty young age. I think I was 36, and made me executive vice president of the company, head of Turner Home Entertainment, 5 divisions, very large part of our company. And I asked him so many years later, I said, why did you do that? I mean, my counterparts in New York and Los Angeles, much older than I am, been in the business forever. Why'd you do that? And he said, well, I thought you were a smart kid. You did a great job for us in the cable sales side. And he said, the most important thing about you, Steve, I knew that you would never steal from me. Of all the things that somebody could say about you, you'd say, really?
Yeah.
That's it?
Oh, that's something.
And I thought about that. And, he had reason to say that because of going to Los Angeles fully clothed and coming home in a barrel.
Yeah.
And I understand what he was saying.
Well, these special...
He's going to get the truth from me. He's not going to...
Yeah. Well, these special projects that you worked on, the through line from Turner to the Beatles that we're going to talk about seems to start with you managing big projects like the 50th anniversary of Casablanca and The Wizard of Oz. What did you do for those? Like, how did you make them special?
Well, in the case of the first really big one we did was Gone with the Wind. And Ted just said to me, first, I want you to run it, make it happen, and make it big. And so what we did is Bob Wessler at the time was the president of the company. He commissioned a documentary on it, the making of Gone with the Wind. Mm-hmm. He attached to that as well.
Right.
And we went back and as we do, I don't know whether you know this, but although those films are stored in a salt mine in Kansas because of humidity and things like that, they degrade over time. So we spent quite a bit of money restoring the film, the sound and the film quality and so forth. And then we would get, like I rented out the Fox Theater, and then I got the biggest movie stars that were still alive from Gone with the Wind to be here, and then Good Morning America and all.
And that's where that's where Gone with the Wind premiered, right? Was it
right? Just across the street, actually.
Oh, at the what was it called?
We just had a frenzy about it. We recreated that time. We were sensitive to the racial issue. Mm-hmm. With the Wind, we brought the mayor in, calmed all that down. Mm-hmm. This is a story, during this time period. You can imagine the sensitivities to all this type of stuff. And, we released it and it just went bananas, millions of copies. And, I think in that case, we probably made $50 million.
Wow.
Re-release of it. And Ted Turner didn't, to his credit, he didn't understand home entertainment yet, because that's not what he thought about when he purchased MGM. He's thinking about television and controlling the cost of TV. It never occurred to him that the big money would be just down the road when home entertainment would become front and center. Mm. That was the magic of it. And he did it. And so we did that with The Wizard of Oz was another, oh my God. We would get a packaged goods company involved and do something like you buy this and you get it $5 off if you redeem it. And we were using everything that is taught in packaged goods. And we did it again and again and again. So we had the format down. And we knew what worked and we knew how to promote it.
Right.
And, it's, you do it enough times at anything, there's trial and error, but you do it enough, you find your niche and you know where it's at and you know where the buyers are going to be and you know what tricks to use in marketing to create the highest level of awareness. And some of the things that many people just really don't know is there's a science behind a lot of this that even I brought to the Beatles, and that science means understanding who's most likely to buy this and at what price point are they most likely to buy it.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Steve, I want to interrupt you for a second. An hour ago, I was sitting here in the studio with an author, Chris Pavoni, who wrote a book called The Doorman, which I absolutely loved. And he was in publishing before he became a 6-time novelist. And we were talking about the difference between structuring a book as a product that people like versus knowing who your audience is.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding who your buyer is and who you write for. Who do you serve in producing this content? Did you understand who you served when you were producing?
Yeah, you do an awful lot of research, but you also must understand the customer. And that's when we understand where our biggest accounts are, like Best Buy.
Right.
And we're going to follow their lead and what they're saying to us. And we'll talk about this with the Beatles Anthology, but you learn an awful lot when you talk to the people that are going to eventually sell it and how they're going to sell it.
So they might tell you that they're interested in.
Oh, I know they're interested.
But they're interested more in DVDs than in audio CDs, or they want to license content for their television commercials or something like that.
Well, yeah, well, that could be. But in the instance, let's take the Beatles, right? We knew, even as I was writing this, the initial business and marketing plan, we knew where the buyers were and where they were going to buy it. There's 7 major retailers that are going to account for like 63% of our sales.
God, that feels like 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Circuit City, Best Buy, Virgin Records.
Right. And what I would have to explain to Paul McCartney and others that were questioning what we were doing is I said, look, first of all, I'm your biggest fan. Okay. But retailing in 1995 is very different than when you guys ruled the charts in 1965. And I said, so today you're not competing so much with other audio or music packages. What you're really competing against is the movie business. And I showed him, I said, look, here's where Snow White's coming, right, from Disney. Here's the slot. And then E.T. from Universal is coming right behind it. That's the slot. We have to be like threading a needle here because it's called open to buy dollars. They want to go deep with us, but they want us to play in their world. They got the bags of cash. Come get it when they have it. Don't tell us what it is. And those are the things that I would have to politely teach the reality of it. Other things like Paul McCartney would say, well, you better make sure, Steve, that this sells for higher than anybody's ever seen. No artist ever got. And I listened to him and I said, I hear you. And I said, let me tell you what's going to happen here with the top 4 retailers. And you're going to be mad if I don't tell you this, because I don't know whether you're going to be reading this when it comes out, but you're going to open up a double truck in the LA Times, which is a huge ad about the Beatles Anthology. It's Best Buy. And they're only charging $16.98. And you're going to explode and say, you just robbed us. And I said, you haven't heard me out. They're using you as a lost leader. They're paying more for your record than they've ever paid for anybody's record. But they want people, it's an event. They want people to come into the stores by the tens of thousands, because once they're in there, they're going to buy something else.
Right. Yeah.
That's what this is all about.
Well, let's take a step back, Steve. You left Turner early mid 90s. How'd you get connected with the music business?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, just after MGM, another thing was put underneath me, which I had no experience in, and we didn't have anybody in the company that had music experience. And so when in those 5,000 motion pictures, there's a lot of music, like Follow the Yellow Brick Road, Gone with the Wind. You must remember this from Casablanca, and it's complicated. And so I ended up hiring this lawyer named David Simone. He was here in Atlanta, had a music publishing background, and he helped me straighten that out. And we just stayed friends. I think I hired him for like 3 or 6 months to set it straight. And once it was on automatic pilot. So David, in the meantime, had moved to Los Angeles and had become the #3 guy at Capitol Records.
Mm-hmm. A division of EMI.
Correct.
Yep.
EMI consisted of 7 different labels. You have Capitol North America, which is the building you're familiar with in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
You have Capitol Nashville, which is Garth Brooks and all of that. You have Blue Note, which is a jazz label with Norah Jones, and on and on. And at the time, I think they're the 3rd largest music company in the world. They're all over the world. And I think it's still pretty much the same. There's 9 or 10 players, like motion pictures or anything else, that pretty much control 90% of everything that you see and listen to. It's a fact. It's consolidated, but they're one of those. And so there was an article about me leaving Turner in the Hollywood Reporter and Variety, which is the trade publications for our industry. And David called me and he said, "What's going on here?" He goes, this can't be. And let's just cut to the chase. I mean, it was time. It's a big management change. You know what happens. Anyway,
corporate shenanigans.
Yeah. And so it was 11 years. It was just my turn. And he goes, "I want you to come out here next week. I know you don't have any background in music, but I got something. I mean, come out here next Wednesday, Steve." So I flew out, went to the Capitol building, saw David, and he introduced me to everybody, the president, all these guys, you know. And he said to me, he said, "Steve, you have such value in the fact of your experience in taking these classic motion pictures and reintroducing them to contemporary buyers. That's very valuable. And we don't have that here. And we're getting ready to do." He said, "Steve, do you like Frank Sinatra?" I said, "Oh, man, I love that guy." He goes, "Well, we're right in the middle of, he's right in the middle of doing the last 2 albums of his lifetime. And they're called Duets 1 and 2.
Right.
And what Frank is doing is teaming up with Barbra Streisand and
Aretha Franklin, Luther Vandross, Julio Iglesias, Bono, and many, many more. By the way, I saw Barbara on the Oscars last night.
Right.
She was not at the same level of performance as she was when she duetted with Frank.
Yeah, you saw that on the tape. But anyway, he said, "Do you want to become a consultant to Frank Sinatra? We would like to sign you."
Speaking of gangsters.
Oh, man. And he said, "You don't have to move out here, but we want you. And you report right into the family, Tina and all of that runs the show." And I just jumped at it. I mean, I loved it. And I loved doing it. Had some input on it. I guess they thought I was valuable. And it you know, went way up the charts. It was extremely successful.
I remember that. I absolutely remember that.
Yeah. And I remember I got invited to his 80th birthday party, and so did 800 other people. It's at the Shrine Auditorium, but it was a television special, but he was seated kind of near me. And, you know, I just always had this thing when I'm working for very famous people, it's not personal. I'm there to do a job. But he was a very gracious guy and gave me the salute with his wife, Barbara, and then Tina. "Dad, you know, Steve's all into this." And yes, thank you. You know, that's what it was. But I was not hired to be in their family or their best friend. I'm there to do a very specific job.
Which is to sell a hell of a lot of music.
Bingo. That's it. And I know that. And so I had a great time, and when it was over, it was over. And so I came back to Atlanta, my little house in Buckhead, and I was producing some other direct-to-video titles, children's stuff to keep me busy. But I get this call, Paul, one day, and it's from Charles Koppelman's office. And I'd never met him. I obviously knew who he was, but it's his assistant in New York. And she said, "Steve, Charles would like you to come up and meet with him 2 days from now. Can you?"
He's the head of Capitol or the head of EMI?
He's the chairman of the whole thing.
Okay.
EMI.
Yeah.
Worldwide.
Okay.
The whole thing.
And that's important because there's different labels involved in the UK and Europe than there are in North America.
Correct. They're selling, the Middle East and the Europe and all,
And there's different distributors and
yeah. But he is the man. He is it. I mean, no matter what your business is, there's some one person that's it. He's that guy. And I said, of course, and I immediately called the guys at Capitol in LA and I go, I got this phone call. You guys know what this is about? No. I said, no. I said, okay. So I fly up, and I go to the big EMI building on Avenue of Americas and go up to his office, and I'm ushered in. And a lot of these things, when you're dealing with famous people or big executives, they make you wait.
Sure.
Kind of like, I'm just sitting in his office for like maybe 15 minutes by myself. I'm offered coffee and what happened. He comes in 15 minutes later and he sits down and he goes, it's really nice to see you. Frank Sinatra and the Sinatra family think the world of you. And
that's a pretty good endorsement.
Yeah. He said, we so much appreciate what you did. And, it was fantastic. And then he said, I guess you wonder why you're here today, Steve. Yeah, I am. He said, well, we're getting ready to do the biggest thing we've ever done in the history of music. And it's going to be called the Beatles Anthology. And the Beatles are recording again, Steve. I said, really? John's gone and he's starting to tell me all this. And he said, Steve, I got a big problem. The Beatles have been with us 1962, and we have had a mercurial relationship with them. They don't trust us, and I've done everything I can.
Why didn't the Beatles trust their label?
Because they were all insiders with them from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But they would say to me later on, it's, hey, Steve, it's the devil we know.
Right.
Is what they would say about it. And so he said, I want you to come with me, Steve. So, it's one of those seminal moments, at least in my lifetime. I'm walking down the hall and we go into this gigantic boardroom, probably the biggest one I've ever seen. It looked like 30 seats. And in the corner of my eye, I could see that there were 7 easels that were lined up blank on the side of the wall. And there was a woman sitting at the end of the table. Her name was Terry Santisi. Terry was the CFO of all of EMI. So it's just 2 of them. So he starts to talk. And he said, the Beatles, Steve, are demanding. They're not asking. They're demanding that we bring in an outsider to quarterback this whole thing. Now, I'm very much against it because I think we already have the finest music executives in the world, but they don't see it that way. And they're demanding it, and I can't do anything about it. And so you are being interviewed today to be the head of the Beatles Anthology. And he says, so he handed me this magic marker. And he said, so why don't you stand up and why don't you start drawing out what this is going to look like?
What did they tell you the project was? What was the anthology? What did that mean?
At that point, I knew that, just in those milliseconds, what it was. It was 3 brand new double albums, 2 new singles, and a 10-hour home video series. It already just inked a deal with ABC Television over the Thanksgiving of that year for a multi-night debut of the series. And so, it was it can kind of take your breath away when you're in that room and when something like that happens to you.
Yeah.
It's kind of like being in the World Series in the 9th inning. And it's either you know it or you don't.
Yeah.
And I had to, I don't want to sound egotistical. I don't. But I just took that pen and I just started drawing it out. It was everything that I'd ever known and learned. And it all came back to my television days and being able to tell a story.
Yeah.
Because in that moment, I realized I'm going to do a who, what, where, when, why, and how. And that's thematically how I'm going to write it. And I just started doing it,
Yeah.
and I guess I was up there for probably an hour. And then they asked me a half hour of questions. Then they had a beautiful lunch delivered. And then he asked me to go back to his office, where I sat for another half hour. And he comes back in and he goes, okay, what I want you to do, Steve, is I want you to fly to Los Angeles next Wednesday. I'm going to roll up all this that you've already written on these 7 easels, and I want you to represent it to the rest of the world of EMI, Capitol Records, at 3 p.m. at the top. And I'd met several of the guys because of Sinatra, so it wasn't like I was going to. So you're going to find this funny. I did it. I did it with the same matter of fact. This is what I think, and this is what, And anyway, went through it all. And they asked 15, 20 minutes of questions. And Charles said, you got to remember, Paul, we didn't have cell phones.
Sure.
We didn't have the internet. It's pre-internet. And so everything was, analog. And so he said, where are you staying tonight? I said, over at the Park Hyatt, Century City. He goes, be in your room at 6 o'clock. I'm going to call. So that's what I did. And you'll find this funny. I still don't know why I did it. But after the meeting, I'm walking out and they closed the door. And I waited like 15 seconds and I knocked on the door again, and they're all in there still. And I said, can I just say one last thing? I said, you guys, there's no doubt that you're going to number one. No doubt. I mean, I think you can put it in a brown paper bag and put the Beatles in.
Right.
I said, you know what? Going to number one isn't good enough for me. And going to number one for the Beatles isn't good enough for them either. And I said, have a nice evening. I can't believe I did that. But
that's a closer right there. That's what a closer does.
But I felt like I can't I knew there were other people being interviewed for this, and I just said, I can't lose this.
Yeah, that's great. So you got the gig. So you get the gig.
Yeah. So he calls me at 6, and he goes, don't you think that was a little dramatic? He goes, it's unanimous. You're in.
That's
and
great.
He said, what do you want? And I just threw out the number, and he goes, okay. And I went, I should have
asked for more.
But right. it wasn't about that. And he said, here's the deal. You gotta move out here right now, like next week. And you got to be here for 2 years. And the Beatles are going to want to meet you personally in about 10 days from now. And I'm going with you to London, and you're going to meet Neil and the rest of them. And we got to go.
Who was Neil?
Neil Aspinall was Paul McCartney's great friend in high school. And in their old hometown, Liverpool, and George knew him, and he became their driver when they first started in 1962. He bought a beat-up van that was gray and red, and he'd drive, and the 4 Beatles sat on a wooden bench in the back with the amplifiers and everything. So he was the driver, taking them to Germany, Hamburg, and back in Liverpool, Cavern Club, and all of that. So what was happening here, and what would stay till the very end, was I was always surprised at how small the Beatles circle was. I really thought something this big would have 100 people involved, and it really wasn't in the end. I mean, it was me and 4 other people calling every big shot, and that's it. Mm-hmm. Now, thousands of people would be involved, around the world, distribution and so forth. But the actual decisions, very, very close.
When you pitched your plans to the band, what did you intuit that they wanted?
I didn't know. By the way, here's the plan itself. I have one of the few copies.
Cool.
That were made. I think they only made 14 of them. and each Beatle got one, and then certainly the executives at EMI and others. But during that meeting that day, it was in the EMI building where if you look at the red and blue albums, they're standing in the stairwell of that building.
Red and blue albums were early compilations, or actually they weren't that. They were like after the band broke up.
Right.
Capitol put out these greatest hits records, which were the records I listened to. The first albums I heard of the Beatles were those greatest hit records.
Well, that's where they're standing. That's the EMI building. Yeah. And that's where this meeting.
Oh, they're on the balcony of the EMI building.
Right.
And one's their early days and one is the later picture. Yeah.
So I'm flown over and summoned there, and Charles Koppelman is with me. Terry Santisi is with me, and Gary Gersh, who is the president of Capitol North America, and me. That's it. And so we're sitting in the conference room, and here comes this guy, and he's wearing like a lime green turban on his head. And that's Neil. And Neil is the CEO of Apple Ltd., their holding company. And, it's a long story, but the Beatles didn't trust outsiders. And they went through a lot of legal pain, which you're aware of. And Neil was it. I mean, you're saying things like, oh, you should have had a professional manager. You should have had a Harvard M. No, that's not who they were. They're going with who they knew at the very beginning. It's all about trust.
So how did you build that trust?
Well, Neil kind of built it for me. That's the first time I'd met him, but let's be very clear here. Capitol didn't want me.
Mm-hmm.
EMI didn't want me. The Beatles demanded me.
But how did Neil know that he could trust you? You didn't know him before that, though, did you?
I think he had talked to various people about me.
Mm-hmm.
I know he did. And I knew the Sinatra said something about me. And and then he started looking at my career. And he looked at Gone with the Wind. He said, this guy, no joke. And then I'd had a couple of phone calls with him. And so we started a wonderful relationship. But during that meeting, I don't remember Paul being really nervous. I mean, this is the first one-on-one. Neil comes in, says what he's going to say, how important this is, and that he's reviewed the plan, that the Beatles are very involved, at least in reading the plan. He said, I was with Paul last night at his home. This is on the desk. He's reading it, and he has some things to say about it. And so during that meeting, the phones light up, and the first one on is Paul McCartney. The second one on is Yoko Ono. And then the third and fourth are the business managers for Ringo and George. That's who's on it.
Oh, Ringo was too busy. He couldn't make the meeting.
Yeah.
Paul McCartney can show up, but Richard Starkey doesn't have the time. Okay, Ringo.
Right. And so I was pretty much doing all the talking because that's what this was about. I mean, they did, Charles was there to support Terry and Gary, but I mean, this is what it's all about. How are we going to sell this thing? And there's 1,000 things that have to be considered. So Paul's on there with me, and he said, this is very extensive. I'm delighted with this, Steve. Clearly know what you're talking about. He said, I got the first question for you. What do you think about the title, Steve, the Beatles Anthology? And I said, well, any issue I have is it's been used before, Paul. It was used by Marvin Gaye. It's been used. I had a couple of other names. And I said, so it's not, from that standpoint, there's precedent for it. So he said, okay, so what do you want to call it? I said, well, I was thinking like The Long and Winding Road. And you could hear a pin drop. And he says to me, Paul McCartney says to me, Steve, I don't care what you call it, as long as you call it the Beatles Anthology. And so I wrote that down. And Neil is kicking me underneath the table because that's the very first time that I would understand really them as a unit, because that song, The Long and Winding Road, was a Lennon-McCartney composition.
But it was really Paul's song, though, wasn't it?
The band. So I'm getting right. I just stepped into the politics of this thing, not knowing that. But I got the answer. It was a Beatles anthology from then on.
Right.
But he would go on. He's a smart guy. I mean, he was saying, and we talked a little bit about the timing of. I've already talked about, when we're going to do it and why we're going to do it that way, and that it's a loss leader. And he talked about pricing, and he was irritated, at first a little about it being. I said, it doesn't matter. I said, what I know really matters to you is the check you're going to get. And the check you're going to get is bigger than any artist in the world ever got.
Is that what they wanted? Was money the motivation?
Well, the money, because he thought traditionally, he wasn't thinking what was getting ready to happen.
Neil or Paul? Are we talking about Neil or Paul here? Sorry.
Paul.
Yeah. It's funny, Peter Doggett, the author of You Never Give Me Your Money, who I interviewed, this interview will air the week after that one interviews. He said that Paul, even at this age, today, still thinks about the chart rate rankings of his songs.
Yeah.
Because that's how this guy, who is a multi-billionaire,
yes,
one of the most legendary people who has lived during the past century, and has level of fame and adoration most of us that all of us could only dream of, he still thinks about his rankings because that's how he measures his success.
Right. I said, look, we're going number one. Get that out of your mind. Right. What we're really talking about here, Paul, is how far this rocket's going to go.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And that was language that resonated with him.
Right. And I said, and you wrote the song, and in the end, I said, this is all about final check of what's really given to you. Mm-hmm. And I said, I don't even want to get into antitrust law and all this Sherman Act and all this stuff, but this is what they want to do. They're honoring you by making you an event big enough for them to lose a ton of money because they're going to create store traffic like never before. And that's what it's about.
Now, you told me after this meeting, Neil, the head of Apple, drove you around London and gave you more insights into the...
Yeah, that was, I thought the meeting was over and we all went downstairs, and I think everybody was expected to get in the same car. And then Neil said, no, you're coming with me, Steve. And he had his driver there, like a Lincoln Town Car. And I just said goodbye to everybody. And Neil said, get in, So where are we going? He says, we're going to drive around London for about 3 hours. And so I just sat in the back with him. And he said, it's really important for you to understand the history here, Steve, of what's happening and the role that you're playing here. You must understand, you do not report to Charles Koppelman or any of those people. You report to me and the 4 Beatles, your estates. That's who you report to. That's why you're here. And you really need to understand that. And every single week, I want to know exactly what's going on, because the fact is, we don't trust them. And so you're our emissary. And we have demanded that you are here on our behalf. And that's what it was.
Yeah.
And he would tell me the history, of them together, how far this went back, all the things that had happened between them, and why, it was Mal Evans was the other guy that was the roadie, and him, and then they had Mal become the driver, and then they promoted Neil to personal assistant. And then when everything went to hell, they made him the president of their company. That's the truth. And they didn't want it any other way. They had another guy that brought in, Alan Klein, that from the music business, and created a lot of turmoil between them. And I'm not here to comment on any of that, but I can tell you that was the time that we're not doing this anymore. We're going back to our roots. It's kind of like Elvis Presley, you mentioned, other people these are people that were with us at the very beginning. We didn't have anything, but we had each other.
Did the four respective parties, Paul, George, Ringo, and John's estate, were they aligned in terms of their goals and desires for the project, or did you have?
Yes.
You didn't just have Neil Aspinall. You had four different people who had four.
No, and I knew that. No, and they were all on the same page. There was no arguing about anything. The Anthology was the last time that they would really work together, and they decided then and there, we better tell this story ourselves.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, somebody else is going to do it. And they're the ones that actually financed it. And so I met the guys that were the producers of the series. Actually, it was 10 hours. I'd like to tell you another short story on that call. After it was over, Yoko really didn't say anything. She introduced herself and she listened to me. But it would be months later, and this really wasn't my idea, but it came to me. EMI wanted to do a theatrical release of the Beatles Anthology. They were only going to do one night. It was going to be at the Sony Theater in New York. Maybe you know where that is today. And they said, you're the only one, Steve, that knows enough about it. It's 10 hours. You got to cut it to 80 minutes. Yeah. And I was in Los Angeles, and Bruce Kirkland came in and said, you got to do it, Steve. And you got to go home right now. And here's the address, tomorrow and Thursday. They're waiting for you down in Long Beach. And this is the production. And this place was wild. This is where they edit the biggest motion pictures on earth, like Jurassic Park and all that. Mm-hmm. And I had all of the 10 hours, but the night before I was able to watch everything. And I don't know if you know film at all, but it all has time code at the bottom. So I'm able to look at the time code so I can understand how I'm going to do this, and where I'm going to make the jump cuts, and how the story's going to flow. Yep. So it saved, something like that could take a month, and this was going to be done in 2 days. And the guys that were assigned to me were just the biggest badasses in the world, and they were huge Beatles fans, and they just couldn't wait to do this with me, and I just had a ball doing it. Anyway, the following week, we all fly to New York, and Yoko Ono is the guest of honor, and there's like 800 people there, sold out. I don't even know that they sold tickets. Maybe it was a charity thing or something. And I was there, and I'd never spoken to her, and I hadn't really, she'd heard me do this, but we didn't have any dialogue. And I was brought down this corridor, and I was oblivious to this going on, but the television network, was live at the same time. And I'm introduced to Yoko as she takes me by the hand and moves me to a little separate place. And she's talking to me. And this is live on because a friend of mine in Los Angeles left it on my voicemail. Steve, you're not going to believe this. But what she said to me that night, she said, I want you to know how much I appreciate you, Steve. And I know all the hard work that you have put into this. And I want you to know that John would be extremely pleased with you and everything that's happened. I want you to know.
That's pretty great. That's pretty high praise.
And I said, well, it's a thrill for me to be here. Yeah. I've loved every minute of it. And thank you.
So how big were the album sales, and how big was the audience?
Oh God, into the millions. We ended up, I can't even, but it's staggering in terms of what it did. In that first pass, over $350 million in sales altogether. And it just broke every record. And again, I had a lot of help out there. I can be the writer, and I did write it over, 5 days and nights at my little Buckhead home, legal pads that were faxed to LA, but it was Bruce Kirkland, executive vice president, who served at Capitol as the editor, and Ricky Mentz, who was the genius creative director that put it all together. So I can write all day, and I know how to do that. But it takes a village to kind of put it all together in a way, in a sense that, wow, this is striking.
Yeah.
Those guys deserve a lot of credit too. But it's like it was a phenomenon. And I'd like to, one of the biggest things, one of the biggest reasons I wanted to do this with you is I wanted to tell you what an interesting time it was. 1997. 1998 would bring devastation to the music industry with Napster. And this was software that allowed millions of people, primarily younger people, to steal music, digital music.
Sure.
And I mean, go back. I mean, it was, Now.
Oh, I was there. I remember.
Yeah. So if Napster had been right in the middle of 1995 and the Beatles, I think we'd still be very successful. We wouldn't have done anywhere near what this thing was going to do. So what we did is historically speaking, and that's why I want to talk about it. It is history. It was the last time that you could market a mega music property in analog.
Right.
Just before digital, Napster, and then subsequently, Apple, iTunes, and because consumers would not purchase music going forward in that sense.
Yeah.
So we position the Beatles Anthology as not a nice to have, but a must have for people who, like you and me.
Yeah.
So it's a soundtrack of your life, and it's important, and it's happening, the first part of it at Thanksgiving. So it's a gift for Christmas and so forth. But
well, it's a great story, Steve. Thanks. And it's I can see the through line from your days at Turner to this great project, and I appreciate you sharing the story.
You're welcome. I loved every minute of it. I think the Beatles are one of those acts that just going to live 100 years from now. Be interesting to see today how many people qualify for that distinction.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing with us, Steve Chamberlain. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Hey, everybody. These are the takeaways from my conversation with Steve Chamberlain. If you're watching, you can see that I am now in the home office, my very well-appointed home office that I like very much, in our home on the Upper West Side. So enjoyed that conversation with Steve Chamberlain. It started as a hey, let's do a follow-up on the Peter Doggett conversation with the Beatles. But I found interesting Steve's early days at Turner Broadcasting. I grew up in Atlanta, as most of y'all know. So I was on the other side of that television when in 1983, I was 14 when he joined the company. And it's interesting to think about how primitive cable television was at the time. I worked in digital media 15 years later in New York City, and the world was a completely different place than where Steve started. Not only was he hawking VHS tapes to Blockbuster, they were building that company, the distribution for the Superstation, which was a UHF channel called Channel 17 in Atlanta. They were building that one deal with one cable operator at a time, trying to get those guys to add it to their system and get the end user to pay, who knows, $2 a month or something like that for access to the Superstation. And it's the reason why a lot of people regionally in the Southeast, well outside of Atlanta, became Atlanta Braves fans back in the 80s, because that's the team they could see. And that was all Ted Turner. And so Steve had a front row seat to that, and I found that very interesting. So a couple of takeaways, things you might not know. Steve was my neighbor in Atlanta, lived down the street. We met through a technology incubator at Georgia Tech, where we were both advisors to some companies, where we both spoke once in a while. I've learned a lot from him over the last, 14 years or something like that since I've known him. I've enjoyed our walks around the neighborhood. He's a smart and interesting guy, and I enjoyed our conversation today. Whatever you're doing in your career right now, somebody's going to be interested in it in 30 years. I remember I played golf with one of the parents of some friends from grade school, and he worked for IBM. And we were playing golf, and a lot of kids from my grade school and high school, a lot of their parents worked at IBMs back in the early 80s. there was a big IBM office in Atlanta and it had a lot of transplants. And a lot of these transplants were from the Midwest and the Northeast. And they were Catholic. And so they'd send their kids to Catholic schools, St. Jude Elementary School and St. Pius High School in Atlanta. There's a lot of parents there. Didn't know what IBM really did. They sold computers, whatever that was. So I had this really interesting conversation asking him about like what they were selling and what the environment was like in 1984, 85 at IBM in Atlanta. But if you think back and like how cool and interesting and revolutionary the personal computer was that IBM was selling, back in 85, but also the big, business mainframe stuff they were doing. It was pretty fascinating. So can you imagine with the dawn of AI, if you're working in AI right now, like how much it's going to change the world and how cool that might look 30 years in the future to just understand what the world was like before AI. It's kind of the experience a lot of us had in the early days of the internet. And then lastly, I think, Steve's journey tells us to say yes when opportunities come away. We didn't talk about his days as a news reporter in Biloxi, Mississippi, or in Florida, but that's how he started his career. And he said yes when opportunities in management came his way. He said yes to go to Turner and then embrace those opportunities and got after them with a great deal of gusto. And so that's why he was able to achieve all he did. And certainly when the opportunity came along to work with Frank Sinatra, well, that led to the Beatles, et cetera, et cetera. So pretty interesting career, lots to learn from Steve, and I appreciate him being a part of the show. All right, thanks for listening. We will see you next time. Take care.